Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Life Burst Podcast. I'm Andrew, and I'm just me today. We're talking about tier lists. Woohoo! Tier lists. I figured to get this out maybe 2 weeks earlier than I normally do. I think I've got a pretty good idea of how this meta kind of breaks down, and I've got my more boring version of it over here. I thought I'd run through it all with you. I know people are pretty psyched about the GP, and they might want to head start into looking at, like, yeah, it's not the GP meta. The GP meta is probably going to be set 13. But it might give them a head start into what they think's working, what they think isn't working into right now with the Disona impact, because Disona is a real impact, I'd say. So I just wanted to go ahead and pop one out here a little early. I don't think preemptive. I think I've done quite a bit of testing because I wanted to start really understanding this set's meta so that way I can jump ahead and it's a bit more digestible to eat half of the Disonas and really understand half of the Disona right now before, going into a world of another half of Disona. So yeah. That's what I'm doing over here. For some bookkeeping here. I've got already on here all of my untiered. I don't think you actually can see my cursor on this. My untiered stuff, which are right now. I just don't see these ones particularly being all that great in the meta. It's not to say that these L rigs won't find a new lease on life later down the line, or have new versions of their L rigs pop up and suddenly make them better, right? And we increase them up there. What you got here, though, that's different from the last time, is I've got D tier already set up here, and this isn't going to be D tier. It's actually I'm dropping them to F tier, but I wanted to make the announcement that I'm sorry, Alos, Peruk, Wolf, Musica, Senga, Eldora, Gazuko, and Carnival. Basically, all of these decks are now Disona pushes out a lot of things, either by pushing them out power-wise or just doing what they were doing, their niche in the meta better. We can talk about that as we go, but for example, Aliok, Alios, Paraluk, there's just more blue-black discard nonsense stuff that's better higher up, so it's not got its access to here. Senga and Wolf basically get pushed out in the same way. They were kind of holding on to these sort of utility green decks that exist, and the Disona utility just out competes them, so they're gone too. Gazuko is the same deal with this Musica. Basically black aggro. If you're gonna play black aggro, you might as well play Tama. Black aggro. Sure, Musica still has a niche, I suppose, being able to be. It's the only L rig that can double play its level 2s. But I don't think that's such a great niche that I'm willing to pull it out of F tier for right now. Eldora is actually, ironically, replaced by pretty much everything that runs Eldora Burst Rush as an assist now. So Eldora's niche was that it kind of was able to really mess around with its burst stuff. But Burst Rush just gives you that access to that pretty much across the board for a lot of other decks, so just not worth it anymore. Carnival actually is a weird one. It gets kind of, I think, pushed out of the meta by Miko Disona, because Miko does a lot of the things that Carnival did as more of a mid-rangey stuff. And then if we're talking about black aggro, pretty much Carnival gets pushed out by every Disona aggro thing that's out there. So I'm putting them all down here. See you later, girls. Some of you guys, I'm sure I'll see you again at some point, like Gozuko with Struggle when that eventually comes out. In the meantime, there's your F tier. I'm not going to go into it, guys. I know some people have requested that I try to give these guys more love than not, and show more deck types they can do. It's not my channel, but there are other channels out there that do that kind of stuff, where they do less solid decks and try to find ways to make them work. And if that's what you guys want to see, there's some really cool channels out there to do. But you guys are here for the new tier list, so let's just get started at it, cracking right away. There's no particular order to this. I kind of ordered it lightly by popularity of the character, I guess. All right, so we've got White Tama, right? Where does Light Tama go in this new meta? And I think the answer is I still don't think anything's an S tier. Is spoilers, by the way. There's something was close to S tier this time around, just like something was close to S tier last time. But I'm gonna put Tama over here in A tier. The Tama deck is still really good. Actually, it can keep up with the Disonas, and crack back for equal amounts of damage. It's able to hold off the Disonas too a little bit, and there's certain ways that if the meta gets a little too Disona, you can actually make your Tamas a little better in certain ways by kind of messing around with some other tricks that you can do. One thing that is to note about Tama specifically is that she is worse now than she used to be, because she used to run 4 Exia, and Exia is just a worse card in general. So her abilities have gone down a little bit because of that, but that doesn't change the fact that it wasn't Exia that was the best card of the deck, it was Remember that was the best card in the deck, so she still got some stuff that she can do. Alright, Tama. This time, Dark Tama. I actually put Dark Tama in the C tier. I think Dark Tama is very good. Realistically, we need to talk about Dark Tama, Hanyo, and Mel, because they're very similar in terms of how they play out, especially because, I mean, they're pulling from the same pool, the Disona pool. Dark Tama helps in a way that it kind of resource drains your opponent a little bit more than the other ones do, which is cool, but and it also has a way to push back against control decks, being that you can discard them down to hell, but Tama still has a way to basically retain card advantage, at least for a fair amount of time. So Dark Tama is pretty good there, but the control decks themselves have all taken a little bit of a beating in this meta. So because of that, the nature of the beast is the things that she would beat are not they still are potentially slightly top dog, but they're not as alpha as they used to be. So it ends up being that Dark Tama's just kind of got less to prey on than it would want, and as such it drops down to C, which is middle of the line for these Disona decks. Some of them are better, some of them are worse. Let's talk about Yuzuki. Yuzuki has actually dropped down, in my opinion, down to all the way to D tier. Yuzuki is still fine. The only reason why Yuzuki is not F tier, and there is a specific reason, is because basically Yuzuki's red aggro deck can be done by almost everything better now. The only small niche it has is that with the color restriction rules being lifted, she can color mess up opponents. So she can prey on greedy decks that exist. So if your meta has some greedier decks, she would be a good call in that scenario. But outside of that, she's just kind of worse than a lot of other red decks that exist right now. Mostly because I think if you're running a red deck, you probably red aggro deck, you should probably be running Disona. They're very powerful and efficient in what they do with the red aggro. Speaking of which, here's Hanyo. So you might be thinking, where does Hanyo land? The answer is top of A tier. So she passes Tama, in my opinion. Both these decks are very similar. They basically are decks that can aggro this game very quickly and win very quickly, being turn 3, turn 4 decks in some cases. But they also have a mode where they can very safely deal 2 damage and 1 damage, and Tama doing that with 2 damage for the Elrig attack and 1 damage from a Signy. Hanyo does it with 2 damage from a Signy attack and then 1 damage from an Elrig. I think both of them are really good. Right now, I give a little bit of a nudge to Hanyo. I just think her cards kind of support the idea of what she's trying to do better than Tama. So I like Hanyo a lot right now. I don't think Hanyo will stay the best deck for a long time. I think it does what it does well, just like Tama. But as such, with Tama, there's ways to figure out how to beat it, and I leave it to the GP grinders to do it. I say that like I'm not a GP grinder myself. Moving right along, we've got Yuki. In this case, it's light Yuki. I guess Yuki is light Yuki. I don't know. Lore of Wixoss is wacky. Where does Yuki end up lying? I think Yuki ends up in C tier as well, behind Dark Tama over here. So my issue with Yuki is that Disona is starting to show some weaknesses in the meta, and you can exploit those weaknesses. And some of those weaknesses are more readily apparent in some decks than other decks. Namely, the more slower decks are a little worse off because they don't have longevity, right? The Disona decks aren't showing great longevity. They don't have a great way to stop damage. They don't have a great way to their life bursts aren't particularly good at stopping damage. Their life bursts aren't particularly good at gaining resources, with some exceptions. They aren't really good at getting resources on their own, with the exception of like Tamago, right? And that's why I think actually Tamago is probably one of the best Disonas out there. But I think it's being underutilized. Yuki ends up being a pretty big victim to that. Yuki needs longevity to work, but it also needs Disona. So it finds itself between a rock and a hard place. Yes, it has a clock in itself, which is why I think it ends up being in C tier no matter what. But because it can't exactly easily keep the game going for on and on and on like a Remember deck or something could, it ends up being in C tier. Speaking of decks in C tier, I believe, yep, Peruk is at the bottom of C tier in my opinion. So I did some pretty hard looks at the meta, and I tried out some Peruk stuff because I actually think it has a little bit of a niche right now, which is that it can present a clock, and it also it kind of, I didn't think worked really long game, but because the games are a little shorter, I thought maybe it had a shot here. It still does. I think it still does the mid-range thing pretty well, and I like that. So Peruk ends up being at the bottom of C tier. I didn't feel like it was the thing that dragged down to D tier. So I think that probably changes as soon as Nanashi comes out in the next set, because Nanashi, I think, does the blue-black mid-range stuff better, period. So it's there. As far as the Hirana goes, right, and this time we're talking about Dash Hirana, we've got our first B tier. Our first B tier thing. I think B tier is the right place to put it. Dash Hirana gained as much as it lost, basically, which is that it gained Disona, and so it runs I think half the deck is probably Disona now, so it runs sort of more of a heavier Disona package. While simultaneously what it lost was its niche as the red Dash deck. I mean, I think Hano can be Dash while simultaneously not having the weaknesses of Dash. That's why I put Hano in the A tier. It can be fast, but it's not giving up anything to be fast, whereas Hirana feels like it's giving up quite a bit to be fast. Nova ends up being in D tier. I don't think Nova's great, but it still has a small niche, which is that Oodles is a real deck, and Oodles is fine in this meta. It's just fine. I wish Oodles was better. I personally like Oodles. But Oodles has just enough proactivity that it can be pretty good. And a 13k power body, sorry, it's 15k, isn't it? That's crazy. 15k power body is relevant. Bang gets rid of things that are above 10k, which is a big change in this meta. However, having two 15ks suddenly makes combat math a little weird. Having three 15ks makes it even weirder. There's a couple ways to accomplish that with your level 2s, and I found that being a niche to potentially stall out Disonas a little bit. It really depends on which deck you're playing against, because they all kind of attack on different axes. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We've got our trusty Lion still somehow hanging on. I want to be clear here. Right, the Hirana deck was teamed at one point, so when Dash Hirana came, it's a different deck. Lion, Team Lion, is the longest holdout on these tier lists to date. Now, yes, I put it in D tier. It is not exactly a great deck, but it still does what it does. Its niche of attacking many times with its L-Rig, right, still hasn't been completely taken over by Tama. The fact that it can do it out of nowhere and be this combo button, I win button, still kind of relevant, right? It's just really, genuinely, really surprising that it's still holding out. I don't know how longer it will hold out for, but I'm happy to see it. You know, I've played Wixoss at this point for 2 years now competitively, so seeing like one of the decks we took competitively to like our first parties is still kind of cool to see. Speaking of which, different deck, but yeah, totally, it's still one of those more relevant L-Rigs that's hanging on. We've got ourselves we've got ourselves Madoka. Now, where does Madoka go? That's a good question. Hello, train. I have been pondering this for a while, and I have tested it, so I'm not speaking out of my butt. Yes, it won a GP. Yes, didn't really get any new toys from the new set. And also, yes, it's important to note that the biggest thing against it is it can't run ultra superheroes for full impact. Like, these other control decks, specifically Remember, can. So where does it land now? And I think the answer is it's still in A tier. I mean, it's weird to say this, but there's two different versions of this Madoka deck that you can run, but notably the Ultra Superheroes version for only 2 modes is still very good. I think you need to swap to a three stop with it now, rather than 2 double 1 stops. But Madoka is still doing work. And in fact, it actually weirdly does some work in this meta that Remember can't do. Namely that it can freeze an Elrig to buy you a little bit more time, and it has a pretty easy access to bottoming deck some Signy. So it actually has access to that accelerator pedal that you're looking to do. Moving on to X, what does X do? X has been a holdout for a while, being one of the only team decks that's been pretty viable. X still ends up being somewhat relevant here. It ends up being in C tier, probably right around here. X is still fine. The fact that you can get Hano Assassin pretty easily takes a lot out of what X could do. What Team X still is able to do is also still able to play out of its trash pretty efficiently. Something that Hano struggles with a little bit. Now, Hano has green as its way to sort of toolbox, and it does a good job. Trust me, it's one of the reasons why it's up there. It still does mean that it can be a little costly, and you have to play your enter out very well. Your enter at any point in time should be spread out so you know exactly what's in it with Hano. And you can play a little bit more forgivingly with X. Also, this is still a meta where you're getting 2 assassins is still a pretty good idea, so it's not terrible there. But its niche has been specifically taken now, and so it's being dethroned. I can see next set maybe this dropping off even. But right now, I'm going to leave it in C tier. I still think it's a solid deck, which is why it stays there, whereas these other ones kind of need luck to win or just don't win on their own. Atomic Deis. Atomic Deis is actually still pretty good. So I do think Atomic Deis is slightly better than Dash Urana, but only slightly. I actually think Atomic Deis has gotten better in this Disona meta than it was prior. And the reason, even though it didn't get much, it did get weirdly Maho as a Signy, so it can now push for refresh damage that it didn't always able to push for. But it also got Unknown Memory, and I think Unknown Memory is great. The color break means that it can also run Exias, and more specifically Yukis, to turn off Remembers. That it's always wanted to run, but it doesn't have to run a white Elrig anymore, which is way better for it. And I think it's a very, very solid deck. And because the games aren't going super, super long, which I do think that Atomic Deis has problems with longevity, it ends up being better because of that. So I think Atomic Deis, this is a chance for it to have maybe one last hurrah before things go away. What's funny is how much Disona actually feel like playing an Atomic deck. They're very similar in playstyle. Miko, what's up, girl? I am excited that Miko exists again. I like Miko as a character. I'll admit it. And she's got a witch broom, so I like her. I've been testing her quite a bit. And I gotta admit, I'm less thrilled than I hoped I would be with her. I think that may change next set when she gets a piece that is very, very good for her. But in the meantime, I actually put her at the top of B tier. I have found a way to make her work in this meta, and it works. She is able to... Here's the thing. She's a turn slower than every single other Disona deck. So once you keep that in mind and you figure out a way to block about 1 turn's extra damage that you wouldn't normally do, then you end up being she can win any Disona matchup you put her in. The problem is she loses every non-Disona matchup that you throw her in. So you can make her very good, but she has a lopsided matchup, which is sad. But I do like playing her. It is funny to ask the opponent to make a choice as to, please discard a card from your hand, and then discard another one, and then your choice of another one. They're like, but I only have 3 cards. And you're like, yep. Also, could you get rid of, I have 2 bangs on the field, could you? Could you choose 2 10Ks that you'd like to get rid of? And they're like, I only have 2 10Ks. And you're like, yep. I think that is a, would you like to bottom deck that or pay 4 enter? I don't have 4 enter. Yep. Yeah, it's very funny that you're giving your opponent choices they don't have. I think that is a funny play style. Speaking of giving your opponent choices, Umir has a Hastilic that you can give your opponent choices with, and it has gotten worse. Which sucks. I really wish it didn't, but it's gotten worse. I am putting it in C tier for now. It could be top of D tier. I'm not sure. Here's the deal. Disona has access to Anna. They also have access to card draw, depending on which Disona we're talking about. They also end the game pretty fast. All 3 of those things are things that I don't think Umir loves, and as such, Umir struggles in this meta. I wish it wasn't so. I like Umir, but it's not quite the case anymore. Moving right along, we've got Mel. Now, here's the dealio. Mel has 2 Elrigs that are viable right now. There's her old Elrig and there's a Disona Elrig. I think her new Elrig is better than her old Elrig, and I know I switched stances on that. Having played Tiffany enough with her making this deck very good now, I have switched stances on that. The fact that she can, I'm just going to put her down because I don't want to hold on to her. The fact that Mel can open up lanes in a different way than Hano is very important. It means that, I think the joke that I was making was that if you had a field of full of mice, right? And they all saw snakes going over, and the snake is Hano, and the snake was eating them all over, they would develop ways to defend against the snake that is Hano. But when an owl shows up, and there's only like 1 owl in that meta, and the owl shows up, it's just going to eat all those mice. They don't have time to waste trying to defend against an owl when they're busy defending against Hano. And the owl in this scenario is Mel. Mel's Lancer attacks in such a different access that these decks that are trying to block the damage can't. They just can't. They can't devote the resources. They'll spread themselves too thin. As such, Mel has actually become very, very good because of that. I put her at second to only Miko because I think Miko beats Disona decks, but does not beat other things. So doesn't quite get into the A range here. And also her existence also depends on Hano's, which is why I think innately it has to be 1 down because of that. All right. Virtual Double Refresh Alpho is a good deck. Is it the best deck in the world? No, I don't think so. Is it a good deck, though? I think the answer is yes. In fact, I'm going to put it at the bottom of B tier. The meta is faster now, which means that refreshing your opponent is actually harder than it's ever been, because the meta is like a turn 4, turn 5 meta. Alpho can still do that. It can do that well. It doesn't get it a 3rd time, but it is able to refresh you twice always. As such, starting your life cloth with 5 life cloth instead of 7 is a pretty big deal, I think. And it's able to, and I think the virtual tools of opening lanes are still very good. So I would put it in B tier, bottom of B tier, but it hasn't lost its niche yet. It's still the only deck that really, if you want a mill deck, this is the mill deck. You use this. I know other people are shouting Toco or Maho Maho or I don't know, Mito. Yes, you can do those with this, but for what it's worth, Alpho does all of it better. It just does it better. So I'm gonna give the nod to Alpho here and Mill in general, with the double Mill Virtuals deck being B tier. I think it's very good. I think it was a great discover at GP. Moving right along, we have II. That's how I would say it. II. II is still fine. Yeah, it's as okay. Spoilers. II is the bottom of D tier. There's no other deck that's gonna be out. II is happy it escaped and didn't get cut off at F tier. It has a very incredibly small niche, which is still I don't think green aggro is great. Mel like really straddles the line between an aggro deck and a mid-range deck, and I think Mel is better for it because it does that. But II is this all-in aggro deck that still can win, right? Like it has these things where you're running and the opponent really doesn't have ways to stop the like dash decks, right? It's basically a green dash deck. You can do really well with it, I think. So I like II just enough to let it escape F tier. And I might stay there for a while. I don't know, but it is a fine deck to choose. Here we have, let's see, that's Sasha. This is Remember Height. Look, hot take. They have very similar character designs. That's my bad. Sasha, where does this end up? Either it's going to be very, very good, or it's going to be very, very bad. And the answer to that is because that's just how Sasha is. It's polarizing, I think. Its job is to stop attacks. And if it can stop attacks, it has a chance to win the game. So you might be thinking we are in a Disona meta where attacking is very good and something you want to do. That is correct. However, it also enjoyed stopping attacks through Exia and also like having 14Ks pretty regularly. Both of those things aren't very good anymore. It also wasn't super great at getting guards quickly, and that hasn't changed. So I think it is slightly worse than it used to be. It's also not great at having a hand. And in a mono white meta where the white aggro decks were giving you your hand back to replay, basically, it kind of was able to ignore one of its weaknesses. Now that weakness is a little bit more readily available. So where does it end up? It's in B tier. It kind of ends up just directly in the middle. I mean, probably around here. I think it's maybe slightly better than Deis, but I think you could argue basically anything in these tiers, you could kind of argue their placement. I think they're correctly placed in terms of the hierarchy, but you could argue some of these up and down, and I probably wouldn't disagree with you. Mew. I'm sorry, I forgot to take Mew out of it. It's an F tier. I know. Someone just got their hopes just dashed right there. My bad. II is in D tier. I think it's top of D tier, close to top of D tier. II is a fine deck. It's still a prototypical tempo deck, but I might as well just jump over here with Mulun first. What really is nailing in the coffin for II is Disona Miko can be a tempo deck as well, very similarly. It enter burns, it enter starves, it can enter starve if you want it to. It can also discard heavily, hyper discard. So it ends up just being better than II in those scenarios. So I just think it's gonna keep falling down. It's still a fine deck, but it definitely needs luck to win nowadays. Mulun also is kind of a nail in its coffin. It's a little bit, it's kind of the more successful version of II outside of Miko, which is just a different deck on its own. Mulun I'm going to also put down over here in high B tier. I don't know if it's faster than Disona decks. I tarry to think that it's not faster than Hano, and I tarry to think that Hano can kind of beat it in that scenario too. But it still does its job really well, which is it opens up a bunch of lanes, and then it draws a bunch of cards so it can have guards. And it keeps up with these decks right now, today. I don't think this is anything anyone saw coming, but yeah, Mulun is still a perfectly fine deck. I don't think it really gained anything from this last set, because this last set wasn't particularly kind to blue decks that weren't Disona's. But it's still a fine deck. Can you run and should you run Disona in it? I don't think so, because a lot of your value that you're getting out of Mulun is from Trouble, and I think you need Trouble and these types of different non-Disona spells to win the game. The real question is whether it gets knocked out next set or not with Peruk coming in to play, and Peruk is kind of also a spells-based deck. This leaves us with, oh god, I was talking about Sasha this whole time, and it was Remember. See, that goes to show how bad I am at seeing the difference between these two characters. Let's just go ahead. Someone's screaming at the screen right now about that. Let's just go ahead. Let's go ahead and put that there, and then let's talk about Remember here. So Remember is actually still really good. If you guys haven't caught the memo, Remember is no longer a 3-color deck, and it is a 4-color deck for sure. It uses red to open up lanes. It uses blue specifically for monomins and random drains to wreck the opponent's hand. It uses black as a way to also help open up lanes while simultaneously supporting the deck. It uses Ultra Superheroes to do a lot. Ultra Superheroes is a very, very good card. One of the few non-Disona pieces that's still an incredible card. And it uses white. That's a good question. I don't know really what Remember uses white for, but it's not very white. It's like 14 white now. Exia got worse, but Remember the Signy got better. So it can play a very good deck game. It can. As such, is it a top of A tier? No, probably. I don't think it's not. I think it's a different type of deck, and maybe equally as important as Hano right now in this meta. But I don't think it is quite as good as Hano. Whether that changes next set and it also starts running Disonas and then runs like the cool Disona pieces, I don't know. The upside is Remember's a really incredibly flexible Signy. Sorry, it's a good Signy too. Flexible Elrig that can adapt its game plan to basically whatever the meta is currently doing because of its extremely good filtering that's always going to be good. So it ends up being this thing where I never really want to write Remember out of the conversation. I don't really want to write Madoka out of the conversation for a very similar reason. I think both of them have reasons as to exist in this A tier and why they've been titans of A tier for so long. And I think everything currently here in A tier is something I would wager a bet would stay A tier for quite a while if you'd like to. Speaking of A tier, Anj. So Anj is clearly a good deck. We know this. I think it is in the middle. That's where I put it of A tier. My reasoning being pretty sound. Anj is a white dash deck, and this new set has been super kind to it by giving it Burst Rush. Now, Burst Rush, basically the minute you put Eldora Burst Rush into your deck, you're like, well, I'm going to win 50% of the time, 100% of the time. It's like, that's your goal, is to basically be like, I bursted really, really well with Burst Rush, and that has caused me to win the game. When you are lacking defensive options, which Anj does, it doesn't filter for guards very well, and it also doesn't have great L-rigs to block damage, or built-in ways to block damage at all, really, then you need to instead go, well, I don't really need to block damage if I kill my opponent first. So you push that angle even harder, and that's what Anj does, and it does it successfully right now, as I'd like to say. I think it's a good deck. Toco, on the other hand, sad to report, top of D tier. Maybe it was bottom of C tier. Or was it? No, top of D tier. Yeah, I wanted Toco to last a little longer on the C tier stance. The angle that it had was that it was able to very, 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 very efficiently open up pretty much all lanes at all points in times throughout the entirety of the game. It's able to present a clock and damage. With Disona existing, and now they are an incredible tool to efficiently still open up lanes at all points in times. The niche that Toco had is fallen a bit. Now, what's worth mentioning, right, is because it's still basically a virtuals deck, right? I mean, you don't have to run it as a virtuals deck, but I don't know why I would run a black deck that's not virtuals or Disona right now. The flip end to that is good, right? The only thing that you get out of that is now you get Lazulite Flash to really do open the lanes even more. Which again, Disona and Hano, these types of decks, can present damage consistently, so without having to sacrifice their piece for it. Alpha Virtuals does the same thing, but it also has the gimmick of being able to double refresh the opponent, which makes them not have access to their resources. As such, I wish Toco, because I like Toco, stuck around longer in the top tiers. I think Alpha does the job better if in that case scenario. Anyways, that's my tier list. There it is. It's all there. That's all VL rigs, unless I missed one. Mugan. I think Mugan's the one I missed. I think someone said that in the comments, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to put that in here. And then I forgot to add Mugan. Mugan's in F tier still. Mugan probably gets better when you have arts. There's no arts yet. So there's your answer. Mugan, I think, maybe it's in D tier. Probably being able to bottom of D tier. Being able to pick up a win every now and then. It still can win its strengths, but the problem is Disona is a meta very fast. Mugan does not like fast decks. Thus, you run into some issues. But that's my tier list, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you guys have any disagreements with me, which I'm sure you do, or you guys don't like the fact that I think Remember and Sasha look exactly the same, you can let me know in the comments below. See you around, guys.